All right, welcome back, class. My name is Julianna Zinchenko, and welcome to my sewing school. On this channel, you will find all kinds of sewing content, from sew with me videos to sewing tutorials. But that's not all we talk about here at my sewing school. And if you've seen my video essays, you know that. Today's lesson, I'm going to be teaching you how to sew a Hong Kong seam. We've been talking seam finishes lately. If you haven't seen my video on bias-bound seams, go check it out. It is a great video to watch right after this one because they are very similar. Seam finishes are used to finish off the raw edges of seam allowances, or just the raw edge of the fabric. A Hong Kong seam is basically just encasing the raw edge of a seam allowance with a strip of fabric. That strip of fabric is called bias tape. Bias tape is a strip of fabric that is cut on the bias. You can either buy bias tape from the store, or you can make your own out of whatever fabric you choose. If you don't know what bias means, check out my video on beginner sewing terms. I go over a bunch of beginner vocab that you need to know. And that video also comes with a free printable PDF, so get to studying. If you're going to make your bias tape at home, it is better to choose a fabric that is lightweight so you don't add more bulk to your garment. Just go with your gut, feel out the fabrics, feel out the fabric of your finished garment, and then decide from there. Now, I also talk about this in my bias-bound seam tutorial, but I think it's important that we go over the difference between a bias-bound seam and a Hong Kong seam. They look very similar, so what's the difference? A Hong Kong seam is just like a regular bias-bound seam. You encase the seam allowance with a strip of fabric. But the difference is a bias-bound seam is used with bias tape that is folded in on both ends. With the Hong Kong seam, the underside of the seam allowance is left unfolded, so that raw edge of the bias tape will be exposed. And you're probably wondering, wait, I'm going to leave the frayed edge of the bias tape exposed. Isn't that gonna end up looking messy? Here's the thing about bias tape. When you cut fabric on the bias, it doesn't fray. Isn't that so cool? So you don't gotta worry about that. And since it's on the underside of your seam allowance, no one's gonna see it. Now, you're probably wondering, when would I use a bias-bound seam and when would I use a Hong Kong seam? You wanna use a Hong Kong seam anytime you wanna reduce bulk. The bias-bound seam adds 4 layers of bias tape, while the Hong Kong seam only adds 3 layers of bias tape. And that one extra layer does make a difference. So a bias-bound seam and a Hong Kong seam are just 2 different techniques that you can use to finish off raw edges. Here is a little history lesson on the Hong Kong seam.
In an article by So Easy by Myra Cecilia, she goes into the origin of the Hong Kong seam. After the war, European and American manufacturing of ready-to-wear garments began to use the factories in Hong Kong for the production of their most labor-intensive garments. High fashion labels found the scarcity of skilled workers and high wages difficult to keep up with the demands of the market. Hong Kong manufacturing offered the answers to these companies due to the flow line production process, otherwise known as mass production, which cuts downtime and costs, increasing the number of goods that can be manufactured. Summer jackets, pants, and suits for once were able to be worn without the lining, reducing the cost of the garment and the comfortability of the wearer. The Hong Kong finish became the go-to seam finish for high and mid-market fashion for unlined mass-produced tailored garments. This stitch represents one of the reasons Hong Kong got to be as rich as it is today.
You will usually see a Hong Kong seam on the inside of unlined coats or jackets, so you can use a Hong Kong seam anytime you don't want to line a garment. Now, of course, you can finish off your seam allowance with a serged edge, but a Hong Kong seam looks so much more professional and high quality. Now, if you watched my bias-bound seam tutorial, you know I get into why it is the little things that change our garments and change us as human beings. Even though nobody sees the inside of your garment, you see it. And looking on the inside of garments and seeing frayed seam allowance edges, it just throws off the vibe of your beautifully made garment. So I encourage you to take the extra steps, even though it's not necessary, to make your garment look super clean and professional. Because it's important that you know it's finished on the inside, because when you put on something that feels very high quality and very professional, it changes your whole mood, it changes your whole vibe, it changes the way you walk in the world. If you've seen some of my videos, you know I am really big on dressing well every day, and not for vanity reasons or anything superficial, but because it truly changes the way you feel. You keep your shoulders back and you hold your head a little higher. I mean, I think we can all agree that we feel much differently when we're in a pair of gray sweatpants versus when we're in a nice tailored pantsuit, or even just a nice top and some jeans. To go along with this, I love to tell the story of Bill Walsh. He was the 49ers football coach, and he took them from being the worst team in football to a Super Bowl victory in just 3 years. You wanna know what he did? He focused on these small things.
He focused on seemingly trivial details. Players could not sit down on the practice field. Coaches had to wear a tie and tuck their shirts in. The locker room must be neat and clean. There would be no smoking, no fighting, no profanity. The standard of performance was about instilling excellence. These seemingly simple but exacting standards mattered more than some grand vision or power trip. In his eyes, if the players take care of the details, the score takes care of itself. The winning would happen.
And that is also what I want you guys to take away from this video. It is the small things that change you as a person and also change the look and feel of your garment. All right, class, without further ado, let's get into the tutorial. But don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button to know when we have class next. Like, share, comment, and follow me on Instagram for more sewing content and much, much more.
Let's go over what we need. We're going to need bias strips. We're going to be making these ourselves in a second. Fabric, I'm using woven fabric, polyester thread, and pins. In this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you 2 different ways you can sew a Hong Kong seam. Let's get into option number 1. I have this satin fabric here, and the right side looks shiny and the back side is more matte. I'm going to put these 2 pieces right sides together, and I'm going to mark where I'm going to sew. My seam allowance will be 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to pin the 2 pieces of fabric so they stay nice and secure as I'm sewing. Then I'm going to sew these 2 pieces together, and don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and end of your seams. Next, I'm going to open up that seam and iron it down so it's nice and flat. Then I'm going to use my tailor's clapper to make my seam nice and crisp. A tailor's clapper is a wooden piece used to create crisp, flat seams and creases. The wood absorbs the steam from the iron and keeps it inside your fabric. Next, we gotta create our own bias strips. Bias refers to the 45-degree angle to the selvage edge. If you're confused on where the selvage edge is, the selvage usually has teeny holes that are poked in it, just like this one right here. Then I'm going to measure 1.5 inch because that's how wide I want my bias strips to be. With the Hong Kong seam, we're gonna end up cutting off the edge on the underside anyway, so it doesn't really matter how wide you make them. You just need to make them wide enough to do the Hong Kong seam. And voila, we are all done creating our bias strips. As you can see here, since we got in the bias, they have some nice stretch to them. Alright, so what I'm going to do is take one edge of the seam and I'm going to match up that raw edge with the raw edge of the bias strip. Then we're going to pin these two pieces together. Then I'm going to sew these two pieces together, and my seam allowance is 1/4 inch. This is what it will look like when you're all finished. Ugh, look at that frayed edge that we need to cover up ASAP. Don't forget to clip the loose threads that are on both ends of your stitch. Next, we're going to iron this down. Once again, using the tailor's clapper to trap all of that steam and make it super flat. Next, we're going to wrap that white bias strip around the raw edge of that green seam allowance. This is what it should look like from the front, and then we're going to pin. Make sure you're only pinning the bias strip and the seam allowance. This is what it will look like when you're all done pinning. Now we're going to sew, and you want to sew as close as you can to the edge of that bias tape. So what I'm going to do is line up that edge of my presser foot with the edge of the bias tape to help guide me so that I sew a straight stitch. Now I'm going to move my needle to the left and to the right to figure out where I want it to go, and I'm even going to lower it into the fabric a little bit to see where the stitch will end up. Don't forget to take your pins out as your sewing machine needle is about to approach them, or else your sewing machine needle might hit one of them and break in half. It really helps to use the presser foot and the lines they give you on the throat plate to sew straight lines. And voila, this is what it should look like when you're all done stitching. And this is what the back side will look like. You see we still have that raw edge of the bias strip. And just like I said in my last video, it's nice to get super straight lines and have everything come out looking professional, but perfectionism isn't the goal because it ruins the fun. Alright, all we have left to do is to trim off that excess fabric in the back. Alright, that is it for option number 1. Let's move on to option number 2 for the Hong Kong seam. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing we did with option number 1. You're going to grab your bias strip and match up the raw edge of the bias strip with the raw edge of the seam allowance. And then you're going to pin them together. And here I am trimming the frayed edge of the satin. We got to get this baby wrapped up in a Hong Kong seam. And once again, I'm going to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to snip off my loose threads, and this is what it should look like when you're all finished. And just like with the first option, we're going to iron it down first. And y'all know the drill. We're going to wrap this strip of fabric around the raw edge of the seam allowance. But what's different about this option is we're going to do a stitch in the ditch. A stitch in the ditch is sewing a stitch in the channel of a seam, which is known as the ditch. It disappears in the seam and it creates an invisible stitch. So just like with the first option, I like to pin where I plan on sewing. So I'm going to pin right in that seam we just did. This is what it will look like when it's all pinned up. Remember, you are only pinning the white strip of fabric and the seam allowance. You're not going to pin that third layer of fabric. And then here's a little tip when it comes to sewing a stitch in the ditch. I lightly pull at the bias strip until I see the stitches from the seam we just did, and I use that as a guide on where to sew. So here I'm finding a line on the throat plate and I'm lining up the edge of my fabric to that. And then I'm going to take my needle and move it left and right to position it. And I'm going to lower it in the fabric just a little bit to see where exactly it ends up. As you can see here, I'm lightly tugging at the bias tape with my pointer finger to reveal those stitches. Be patient with this stitch because the more patience you have, the better it will look. Don't let the speed of these clips fool you. I take my time with the stitch in the ditch. And there we have it, a finished stitch in the ditch. You can barely see it. And I did black thread for the sake of this video so you guys can see, but imagine if this thread was white. Here we have a crisp, clean Hong Kong seam, and of course the last thing we have to do is trim off the excess fabric in the back. The last thing that I'm going to do is flatten out this bias tape so that it spills over the stitch in the ditch and it conceals it completely. I am using the edge of my iron to do this. And voila, that is it for the second option for the Hong Kong seam. And if you use it, please tag me on social media at Julianna Zinchenko. I would love to see your Hong Kong seam.
Alright class, that is it for the Hong Kong seam tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to ask me any questions in the comments below, or you can DM me on Instagram at Julianna Zinchenko. Class is dismissed. I will see you in our next lesson. Love you.